That night was one of the longest and worst nights of my life. Not only was I on a 74-kilometer march in wintertime without shelter, without food, and without water, but hundreds of thousands of people, and many of them vulnerable people, were on that walk too. And they continue to be on that walk, and they continue to lose their livelihoods as the Russian invader presses further into their country. So my name is Manny Marotta. I'm 25 years old. I'm sort of an amateur journalist from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA. And 2 weeks ago I came to Ukraine with the intention of covering the tensions with Russia. And then the war found me. On the morning of the 24th of February, I woke up to the sound of air raid sirens in Lviv. There were loudspeaker announcements saying that everybody should get shelter, should stockpile water, should help the elderly and the children, and should proceed in an orderly fashion. And I knew that it was time to leave. So I looked at the road west, the long road west, and I decided to walk it. It would only be 16 to 20 hours after all, I reckon. At first the day was sunny. It didn't seem like there was a war going on at all. The day was fairly decent. There were cars still coming down the road beside me. But then all of a sudden I passed these petrol stations with lines just down the block. And these cars that had run out of gas and that had been abandoned on the sides of the roads. And their occupants had taken everything they could out of these cars and were just walking it toward the border. And this was hundreds of thousands of people who had no access to food, water, toilet, shelter, warm clothing for hours walking. Finally, about 10 kilometers from the border, soldiers started coming around, Ukrainian army soldiers with loudspeakers declaring that President Zelensky had announced that 18 to 60-year-old men had to come back behind the lines, had to come back away from escaping from Ukraine, and had to come and serve their nation in this dire time. They were being conscripted. I was talking to one of those men throughout the walk. I made friends with a 24-year-old named Max. He was about my age. Maxim, you are still waiting in this line, hoping that you will get through.
Yeah, I really hope that I will be so lucky to cross the line, but I hear the man yelling that
yes,
we all should come back, all Ukrainians, I mean.
Are you afraid? And by the way, behind you right now are tons of Ukrainian men who are leaving the line. Well, I was talking to him while I was doing a short interview with him. One of the Ukrainian army soldiers yelled toward his direction. He had to leave the line. There were tears, there was screaming, there was a little bit of physical violence. I did see a soldier hit a woman once. And so, bereft of men, the column pressed onward and reached a human crush at the gate before the border. They were letting in 10 people every 20 minutes, and there were 2,000 people there. It was just this horrifying thing to see as people pressed themselves against one another at the border, how they were crammed against one another, how they pushed and shoved. They didn't show any empathy toward the children and the elderly. There was no toilet, there was no food, there was no water. We were in this condition for hours. Eventually we got through that cordon. Eventually we got through to the poles. It was dawn. The sky was breaking in these pink and blue shades. It was fluorescent. And we saw in that dawn a glimmer of hope. Because the Poles let us in, we were greeted with hot tea, pastries, and a bus to Przemysl. That cup of tea was absolutely incredible, and I had had nothing hot to eat or drink for 21 hours or 22 hours at that point. And so it was just, I mean, it was a great cup of tea. It was almost like a 5-course meal at that point. Nobody had slept. Most of the people with us had lost everything, almost everything. They were carrying what they had with them. But more than their possessions, they had lost their family members, they had lost their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their friends. And they were now in a country that was unfamiliar to them for an indefinite period as their own homeland got invaded. So I'm in Krakow, Poland now. So many Ukrainians are seeking refuge here because the Poles are showing great hospitality and great solidarity with their Ukrainian brethren. That night was one of the longest and worst nights of my life, perhaps the longest and worst night of my life. Not only was I on a 74-kilometer march in wintertime without shelter, without food, and without water, but hundreds of thousands of people, and many of them vulnerable people, were on that walk too. And they continue to be on that walk, and they continue to lose their livelihoods as the Russian invader presses further into their country.